is a 1993 GMC Typhoon, and it's the original high-performance SUV. It may not look like much, a 90s General Motors SUV, but I can assure you it is much. The first performance SUV ahead of all the others that have followed. And today, I'm going to review it. Before I get started, big news, this GMC Typhoon is currently being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This Typhoon has relatively low mileage and a great color, and you can bid on it on Cars and Bids. So, once you're done watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this GMC Typhoon, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. So let's talk Typhoon. This was based on the GMC Jimmy from the late 1980s and early 1990s, and they decided to make a high-performance version, even though nobody was really doing that at the time. To create the Typhoon, GMC took the Jimmy, lowered it, gave it some styling upgrades, and turbocharged it for big power at the time. And today, I'm going to show you everything. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the Typhoon and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Typhoon with probably its most important component, and that would be under the hood. This was the first performance SUV, and all of the performance came from this. It was a 4.3-liter V6, just like what you got in the regular Jimmy, except in the Typhoon it was turbocharged for a pretty monstrous 280 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque. Those were massive numbers for an SUV back then, and especially massive numbers for one this size. And turbocharging was a really big deal. Nobody was doing that back in the early 90s. Now you take it for granted most cars are turbocharged, but back in the Typhoon's era, it was a huge deal, and this vehicle was kind of a pioneer. And to account for the extra power that came from turbocharging this engine, General Motors had to upgrade this engine quite a bit. They used a lot of more robust parts that came from the 5.7-liter V8 that was used in other larger General Motors vehicles at the time in order to deal with all the power that this V6 was making. Now, one interesting thing, when you look under the hood, you can see the engine says on it, not Typhoon, but instead Cyclone. And you might be wondering, well, what is that? Is that the name of the engine? Well, not exactly. You see, the Typhoon was the second vehicle in a series. It was a high-performance SUV, came out in '92, but it came after the GMC Cyclone, which was a high-performance pickup truck that came out in '91. The Typhoon was the very first performance SUV. The Cyclone was among the very first performance pickup trucks, and GMC put this powertrain into both vehicles. Since the Cyclone came out first, it had the engine first, and I guess they didn't bother to change the engine when it went into the Typhoon. So the Cyclone came out in '91, and it was only sold for the '91 model year. General Motors sold about 3,000 of them, and I guess they decided maybe an SUV would be a little bit more popular with the performance crowd, and that proved to be true. The Typhoon came out the next year in '92, and they sold about 4,700 Typhoon models between '92 and '93, so the Typhoon is a little more common than the Cyclone. But the Typhoon isn't quite the performer that the Cyclone is. Not to say that the Typhoon was bad. This vehicle weighed in around 3,800 pounds, and 0 to 60 with this powertrain was in the low 5-second range, which was amazing for that period, especially for an SUV. But the Cyclone was lighter than the Typhoon with the same powertrain, and it did 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds, which is still fast by modern standards, and it was an incredibly fast time back in the early 90s, particularly for a truck. In fact, Car and Driver famously did a drag race road test with the Cyclone against a Ferrari 348, which was the new Ferrari at the time, and the Cyclone Cyclone 1, a pickup truck in the early 90s, was faster than a brand new Ferrari. It was incredible, and so was the Typhoon, and both of these vehicles helped to kind of kickstart the performance truck and performance SUV markets. But the extra power wasn't the only benefit the Typhoon had over the regular Jimmy on which it was based. There are actually quite a few upgrades to the Typhoon. For one thing, it was lower. This is lowered compared to the standard Jimmy. It obviously looks sportier and cooler, and I'm sure that helped handling in case you wanted to get this out on the racetrack. More obviously, it had this like body kit. You can see this lower body cladding that goes around the entire bottom half of the vehicle. That was Typhoon specific, and it gave it kind of a sporty, exciting look on the outside. And in that vicinity, you can also see the wheels. The Typhoon had upgraded, sportier looking wheels compared to the standard Jimmy, which gave it kind of a more exciting, more performance-y look, which complemented the other changes on the outside. And then there were the colors. Now, virtually all Cyclone models were painted black, but the Typhoon, they decided to get a little crazier. A lot of Typhoons were indeed black also. It kind of went along with the performance SUV theme, but there were some special colors. There was a bright teal, for example, and you can see there's this, which is called apple red. It's a very rare color. Only a few hundred Typhoons were made in apple red, but it definitely helped it stand out. And all of the fun colors, that was kind of the goal, to look a little different and more exciting and more sporty and cool compared to just a standard workhorse Jimmy. And one other interesting upgrade in the Typhoon compared to the Jimmy was all-wheel drive. Back in the Typhoon's day, most SUVs were intended for off-roading, going over mountains, and so they all had four-wheel drive. But the Jimmy, that wasn't the purpose, and General Motors knew it. So the Typhoon borrowed the all-wheel drive system from the Chevrolet Astro and GMC Safari minivans rather than some robust off-roader four-wheel drive system that would never get used. It makes sense by modern standards, but back in the day there were very few all-wheel drive SUVs. In this era, most SUVs were selectable four-wheel drive with a high range or low range rather than all-wheel drive like the Typhoon. But anyway, next up, let's move inside the Typhoon. I'm going to start with just getting in, which requires you to choose from one of three different keys. You can see them all here. This was common on General Motors vehicles at the time to have three separate keys, and they do three separate things. One is for the ignition, one is for the doors, and the other one is for the fuel door. So that's not all integrated into one key. You get three keys for three different functions. But anyway, once you climb inside, you can see that the keys aren't the only things. It's very late 80s, early 90s General Motors. The entire interior clearly feels like a General Motors vehicle from that era. And that means lots of plastic and lots of squares. Right angles was all General Motors was doing in interiors at this period, and this one certainly looks a lot like that. And you can also be sure General Motors interior from this era will have a lot of quirks, and this one indeed does. For instance, the Typhoon was this special, expensive, limited production, high-performance SUV, and to commemorate that on the interior, you got a little Typhoon badge on the glove box, and that was it. There is nothing else in this interior that really stands out from a regular GMC Jimmy interior in the early 90s. You paid more for all this power, this special vehicle, and you didn't get any real reminders or upgrades in this interior. It was the engine, the exterior styling, and I suspect a lot of profit for General Motors. But anyway, in this interior, there are many more quirks than just that, starting with the window switches on the driver's side door panel. You can see driver and passenger have two different switches, two different types of switch. The driver one is different from the passenger one, I guess, so you could feel which one you were touching and then more easily figure out which window you were rolling down. They provided two different window switches next to each other on the same door panel. And interestingly, the sunroof switch is here on the ceiling, and it also is different. You can see totally different design. You press that and the sunroof would tilt open. So you had three different types of window switches for three different opening windows in the Typhoon. Kind of strange. And the weirdness around switches definitely continued beyond that. For example, the Typhoon has power mirrors, which is a nice luxury, but you can see they were clearly an afterthought tacked on to the bottom of the dashboard right here. This vehicle was not designed to have power mirrors, but it was obviously put in later, and so that switch was just kind of stuck on there. Same deal with fog lights. I suspect the regular Jimmy wasn't designed to have fog lights, but the Typhoon added them, and so the fog light switch is just tacked on to the bottom of the dashboard. Absolutely looks like some sort of aftermarket add-on, but those did indeed come from the factory, just not very well. And how about this for an interesting switch-related quirk? These switches that control the rear window have faded faster than the rest of the switches in this interior. So you can see this button here pops open the rear glass, which is a pretty convenient feature to have, and then you have these switches to the left of the steering wheel, which control the wiper and the defroster back there, and they've all faded more than the other switches around them. Now clearly this is because these switches came from a different supplier or just used different materials, but it's interesting that it affected all three of the rear glass switches and none of the other switches in this interior, maybe because the early Jimmy models didn't have those sort of controls for the rear, and they were also added later and just used a different material that faded faster. And speaking of interesting switches in the Typhoon, the headlight control in this vehicle is a rather interesting one. To turn on the headlights, you press this little switch, and you can see it moves a rather large contraption. When you go to turn off the headlights, you can't just pull back the headlight switch that you push to turn it on. That's the logical thing you would think to do, but it doesn't work, because if you do that, the parking lights stay on. In order to turn off the headlights, you have to actually press off over on the side of the headlight switch, and only then will you turn off both the headlights and the parking lights. A little confusing, a little weird, and probably led to some dead batteries when people didn't realize how this switch worked. Now next up, another quirk of this interior. This car came from the era before cup holders. They weren't just skipped from this vehicle, but they weren't included in a lot of vehicles from the late 80s, early 90s, but they sensed that cup holder demand was coming, and so there are some half-hearted cup holders on the inside of the glove box lid. You open this up and you can see you can't actually stick anything here because it'll spill when you go around a turn, but I guess when you're stopped and just sitting in your truck, you can use that to rest your drinks if you're like on your lunch break or something. Also, another cool feature in here, inside the gauge cluster, you can see the turbo boost gauge, which by modern standards isn't really all that special. Again, turbocharging has become so common in modern cars, but back in the early 90s, nothing was turbocharged, especially not SUVs, and this thing was a really big deal, and a turbo V6 was really special, and being able to watch the turbo boost while you drove around, that was pretty neat. But there are a few interesting quirks in this interior that frankly I wish modern cars would adopt, one of which is the fantastically easily accessible climate controls right here next to the steering wheel. This is almost Ferrari-esque in how close it is. You can take your hand off the wheel for only a quarter of a second, make an adjustment, and go right back to the wheel, so you don't have to be hands-off for very long when you're driving your Typhoon hard on the racetrack. I'm sure that's not actually why they did it, but it is good and convenient placement for the driver. Speaking of the climate controls, another thing I like in here is this climate vent, which is aimed at the driver's lap, allowing you to heat or cool that area. Modern cars lost this climate vent, but it is a pretty good idea in a pretty good spot, especially if you're really hot, to get as much cool air on different parts of your body as possible. I also like the fact that next to this climate vent, you have a little shelf going basically the entire length under the dashboard, which is convenient if you want to put stuff, you can't fit it in the glove box, get a little more storage integrated into the dash. But my very favorite items in this interior might just be two rather comical warning labels. One is right here in the gauge cluster where it says premium fuel preferred. Not premium fuel required, just preferred. You could put in regular, but they would really like it. Please, will you put in premium? That nice little request is made in the gauge cluster. I also absolutely love this warning label printed on the sun visor, which basically tells you that this isn't an off-road vehicle and you can't take it off-roading because it is lowered and it has a body kit and you will damage it. This label is comical to imagine now because there are so many performance SUVs that you would never dream of taking off-roading, and you don't need a label to tell you that. But in the Typhoon's era, virtually all SUVs were intended for off-road use, and GMC didn't want anybody to make the mistake of trying to think that this was an off-roader. So they put that label there to remind you not to off-road your SUV, which would have been mind-blowing 30 years ago. And then you have the back seat of the Typhoon, which I shall climb into as I do right now. It's a little bit tight back here, and getting in is pretty tight. And frankly, that's kind of a shame because they made a four-door GMC Jimmy in the early 90s, but all of the Typhoon models were two doors. I guess it was deemed that two doors was the right number of doors for a sporty vehicle like the Typhoon. But anyway, once you're in the back seat, you quickly discover the back seat has a few rather interesting quirks of its own. For one, there's only 2 seats back here. You don't have a middle, so this is a 4-seater, 2 in the front and 2 in the back, but you do have armrests. On either side of the back seat, you have these overstuffed armrests that you can stick your arms on and rest them while you're driving along, riding as a passenger in the Typhoon's back seat. It's kind of a nice luxury touch in the back. You also have, below the armrests, these zippered pouches, which, strangely enough, are for storage. Leather zippered pouches. You have one on each side. You can unzip them and then use them to store stuff, I guess, when you're sitting in the back of the Typhoon. A very strange feature. And finally, our last interesting item back here, you have rear ashtrays. Because, of course, you have rear ashtrays in a 90s vehicle. Even though these are the back seats, which won't get used that often and might be used by children, you still have to have individual rear ashtrays, one on either side. This is made even crazier by the fact that this rear window doesn't go down. It doesn't even open for a vent. So smoking back here, not really advisable, but because it was the early 90s, late 80s, and everybody smoked, you got ashtrays anyway, even in the back. And next up, moving outside the Typhoon for some more interesting quirks and features, but I want to start with the cargo area, and specifically accessing the cargo area. Now, you come to the handle back here, and you can see 2 words printed: glass with an arrow pointing down on the left side, and gate with an arrow pointing down on the right side. Let me show you how that works. You stick in the key, that would be the door key, of course, not the ignition key, different things. You stick in the key, and then you twist it to the left to open up the glass, which is kind of a cool idea. The glass opens independently from the tailgate, and that way you don't have to open up the entire tailgate if you just want to put in some small, lightweight item. You don't have to go through the trouble of opening up the entire thing. But if you need more space back here to load something larger, you then twist this handle the other way where it says gate, and you can open up the tailgate itself, which, as you can see, opens down, sort of a split folding situation. So you have the options for a glass and a gate. Now, when you look back here, you can see a fairly standard cargo area, nothing particularly interesting, but you do have a spare tire back here. It's obviously a smaller tire than what's on the vehicle, but it's like a temporary spare inside this cover, and strangely enough, the cover has on it a little pouch where you can store stuff. So you might be upset with the spare tire for stealing some of your precious cargo area, but you do get a little bit of it back thanks to this little storage pouch on the spare tire cover. Kind of a strange thing. Now, also interesting in this vehicle, another quirky warning label is printed on the lower part of the tailgate. You can see it says, "Notice, do not tow a trailer with this vehicle." And again, it explains it could damage the engine and transmission. This was not supposed to be a work truck. No off-roading based on that visor warning label, and no towing either. Even though it had extra power, the power was for performance, not pulling. But anyway, next we put up the tailgate, and you can see the badging. Over on the right side, the passenger side, GMC truck, which is how most GMC models were badged in this era. GMC was really trying to sell itself as a truck brand, kind of like they are now. Now, over on the left side, you can see the Typhoon badge, which is really just a decal, but it's in this kind of cool, crazy, wild font to make it clear that this isn't just a regular old GMC vehicle. You also have another one of these Typhoon badges on the side, as you can see here, same font, same decal, and it looks cool and different, but it's worth noting that's the only exterior badging you really have, giving away that this is a Typhoon. They didn't really get too far into it, which kind of surprises me, just sort of some subtle badging cues. And speaking of badging, one other quirky one is on the front grille. You can see the GMC badge is up there, and it's reflective. At this time, GMC's logo was always in red, but I guess on its vehicles it was actually a reflective red that would glisten in the sun or when headlights hit it. Never really noticed that before. Rather unusual and quirky. And since I'm talking about the exterior, I might as well cover the styling of this vehicle, which frankly is pretty subtle. Like I said, no real badging on the outside that indicated this was a Typhoon or it had some big turbo V6 with extra power, could beat a Ferrari. You just didn't really have that stuff in this vehicle. Now, there were the styling upgrades that I showed you before, the body kit, the wheels, but that's just not all that much, especially by modern standards for performance vehicles, and especially performance SUVs, which are usually pretty shouty and loud about what they are. Now, personally, I like the sleeper effect of this vehicle, that nobody really knows what it is until you're beating them, but I could see people in the period kind of being a little disappointed that it doesn't show off what they got a little bit more. With that said, it's hard to fault GMC for not really taking any risks with the styling, because there was nothing for them to really compare this to. There were no benchmarks for them to say, well, that succeeded with that vehicle, that failed with that vehicle, so let's try this. They were totally flying blind. There had never before been a performance SUV, so they just decided to do this and give it a shot. And frankly, I think it looks pretty good. It works pretty well. And so those are the quirks and features of the GMC Typhoon. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the GMC Typhoon. Now, I did a video with the Typhoon a long time ago, years ago, but it was not in my current format, was not very in-depth, and I really wanted to cover one in a lot more detail, and that is this. It's rare that you find one of these. They only made 4,700 of them, like I said, from 92 to 93. So it was 30 years ago and less than 5,000 built. And there was a period where these got pretty cheap. So a lot of them were damaged or destroyed and people didn't really care about them. And a lot of them were heavily modified. And I don't generally review modified cars in this channel. So finding a nice stock one is a challenge these days, but values are starting to come up. Enthusiasts are starting to take note. And especially because this performance SUV segment has really taken off like a shot, people really now are starting to want to be part of some of these original ones, you know, just like in any segment where the first cars become valuable and desirable. That's clearly happening here to the Typhoon. So first things first, everybody wants to know how fast is it. I'm going to floor it here. It's quick. It's reasonably quick, I suppose. It's not what I would consider to be a particularly fast car by modern standards. It makes a lot of noise, and you can tell there's a lot there. Like, the powertrain wants to go, and it gives it some power, and it's doing what it can, but the transmission seems to be a bit of a problem here. All General Motors automatic transmission vehicles from this era came with a 4-speed automatic. It's not a particularly desirable transmission in terms of ultimate performance and driving excitement. This car is relatively quick, and it gets into the turbo boost, and I'm looking at it. I mean, it goes. It's especially from a mid-range, it goes pretty well, but it's really dulled by the performance of the transmission. Ultimately, you know, it can't go down that many gears. When you floor it looking for more power, more muscle, it can't really do all that much with it. But it is a pretty strong powertrain, as you can see. Now, from a steering and handling perspective, I suspect this probably felt incredibly athletic back in the early 1990s, but by modern standards, it really doesn't all that much. Feels like a General Motors SUV that they tried to make into a performance-y version. So it's a little bit better, it steers a little bit better, it drives and handles a little bit better, but we're not talking about like a BMW X5M. This is no Porsche Cayenne. Ultimately, this came out 10 years before the Cayenne first came out, 8 years before the X5. Like, the concept of a car-like sporty driving SUV just had never really even been thought of. Even like the regular non-performance luxury crossover, the Mercedes ML didn't come out until 98, the RX in 99. There was not a big push for like car-based performance crossovers. It just wasn't a thing. And so this, obviously not car-based, but this, you know, being a performance SUV was a totally different experience than anything that anyone was used to at that time. Okay, so it's not incredibly fast by modern standards, and it doesn't handle incredibly well by modern standards, but I gotta say, I feel cool driving this around. I remember when I was a kid, you would occasionally see a Typhoon or a Cyclone on the road. That was a cool experience then, but I don't see them anymore ever now. They're going into the hands of enthusiasts and collectors and people who don't really use them as much as they used to get used. They're becoming valuable and more desirable. If I saw one of these now, this is the kind of car I would hurry up and catch up to and take a picture and send to my friends. This is a really actually special car, and it takes like an interesting and special person to own it and to keep it going. These turbo V6s are not, you know, standard fare in the GM world, but this is a cool car, and it doesn't, just like any classic car, just like any 30-plus-year-old car that started a trend or a segment, it's not as good as the modern cars that are in that trend or segment. and that's not really a surprise. But you can see how it all started and where it all started, and it feels special to be in that vehicle, especially one as ridiculous as the Typhoon with its big turbo power and its kind of crazy body kit, and just, it was an alien back then. And I've always felt that these things are really cool, and I feel really special driving this one. And so that's the 1993 GMC Typhoon. The performance SUV segment is now so popular, it's hard to believe it didn't even exist 30 years ago, but this is where it all started. And now it's time to give the Typhoon a Doug's score. And the Doug's score is here, 45 out of 100, which places the Typhoon here against, well, this car has no real rivals. Amazingly, it ties the Lamborghini LM002, which is the only other vehicle from the Typhoon's era that could remotely be considered a performance SUV, though the two vehicles get to their scores rather differently. Truthfully, the Typhoon has no equal from its time period, and I personally think these are a bit underrated considering the early role they played in the development of the performance SUV. But most importantly, the Typhoon is just plain cool.